Please welcome Mr. Jon Ossoff.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for having me this evening. It's great to be back in New Hampshire. I've got a lot of family up here, family in Concord, family in Nashua, and have been coming up here since I was a kid. My great-grandparents came to the eastern seaboard and settled in Massachusetts, came from Eastern Europe around the turn of the century with very little more than the clothes on their backs. And they struggled for a while, built a business, a filling station, a petrol station, a mechanic shop, where my grandfather worked as a young man with his brothers. And then the tumult of the early 20th century swept across the world, and my grandfather and his brothers shipped off for war, came back after serving in the Pacific, settled down on the North Shore of Boston, Massachusetts, started a business, a leather tanning business together, the brothers. Built that business and lived the American dream. My father, who's here this evening, was the first in his family to graduate from college. My mother, who's an immigrant from Australia, the first in her family to graduate from college. And I grew up having been taught that that was the kind of country that we lived in. One where immigrants could come, be welcomed, work hard, get ahead, build a life, build a better future for their children. And that's the reason I've had the kind of opportunities that I've had, to get a great education, to do what I'm passionate about, ultimately to run for Congress. And what motivated me to run was a sense that that vision of our country that we all share and that story that we all believe in is at risk of abandonment. And I woke up the morning after the presidential election, and one of the things I asked myself was, what would my grandfather and grandmother think about this outcome? Think about the kind of leadership that would be moving our country not forward but backward. Leadership that took power on the basis of deception and division and the scapegoating of immigrants. Leadership that has more to do with dividing people, fanning the flames of hatred and bigotry, than serving the public interest and moving the country forward. And I thought about what my grandfather and my grandmother would think about it, and talked to so many of my friends and family who felt that concern that many of us felt, I think regardless of our political party, that we were losing touch with our core values, that the proposition that had been made to us by Donald Trump as a candidate and now as president is that our country must abandon its core values in order to be safe and secure and strong. And my belief is that our country can only be safe and secure and strong if we stay true to those core values. And that it's incumbent upon our generation to show something of the courage and leadership that my grandparents' generation showed in much more difficult times, to step up and take risks and fight for the kind of society that we can believe in and that we want to live in and that we want to leave to our children. So I decided to run for Congress in a district that had been held by Newt Gingrich, that had been held by Tom Price, that had been represented by Republicans since the late 1970s. And it became a hell of a fight. I knew that it was a particular moment in history and that the traditional party lines were shifting, that people were questioning their own political identities, and that there was the potential for a huge outpouring of energy to make a statement in the first months of this administration that folks were not defeated, they were energized and ready to push back. But I could not have anticipated how big it would become. More than 12,000 volunteers who worked on the campaign, more than 400,000 people who contributed to the campaign from across the country in average chunks of less than $30, up against a huge amount of money from Washington super PACs that came down into Georgia during that race. And it was a hugely inspiring thing to be a part of. And for a while, my community in Georgia was a beacon of hope, I think, for folks across the country and around the world who were looking for some sign, who were looking to the American people to demonstrate what we were made of. That those values of my grandparents' generation of courage and humility and decency and respect still animated us as a people. And ultimately, I was defeated. But I think that the statement that we made by putting up that kind of fight, where no one thought it was possible, was worth doing. I think that even when we lose, the fight can be worth what it builds. I think that we demonstrated that ordinary people banding together can generate the kind of power that can strike fear into the hearts of the most powerful people and organizations in the world. So I came out of the election, of course, disappointed, but with so much respect and appreciation for all of the people who had joined me in that effort, and with a lot of hope. At times when hope sometimes seems in short supply, that folks standing on the right side of history, that folks who believe in a decent America, that rather than funneling wealth and power to the most powerful trade groups or the billionaires who fund our political system, invests in a country where, as in my family's story, an immigrant can arrive here with nothing and build a future for themselves and their families that is prosperous and safe and that contributes to a diverse and thriving and prosperous society. So I thank you all for having me here and for your interest and for the invitation, Neil, and look forward to your questions. And it's an honor to be back in New Hampshire. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Jon, and thank you for being at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics tonight. It's a real pleasure. As many of you know, Jon has a relative here, Professor Ossoff, Liz Ossoff, who I think has perfect attendance at our events. And she's been a contributor of the Institute for many, many years in many capacities. And so we thought it was very interesting. It's a very unique last name, so we said, boy, there's got to be a connection, and there certainly was. And so thank you, Liz, for being here tonight as well. So you jump into this race, which is clearly a lean Republican district. It's a complete uphill battle. Did you ever have any idea that you were going to get this much attention, have this much money, this many volunteers spent on both sides in this race when you signed up?
I had no idea that it would become what it became. But I did think that though there was a sense of defeat and a sense of hopelessness for many in the first months of the year, that was quickly going to become the kind of energy that we saw in Georgia and that we're seeing across the country now and that we've seen in Virginia and now in Alabama and that I think we'll see next year. I think that the moment that we all realized how much power was out there, how much power was being generated by ordinary people who had never been involved in politics before was around the time of the Women's March. And in Georgia, we had 63,000 people, as I recall, organizing and making their voices heard. And many of the women who organized that march wound up establishing groups across Georgia who played a key role in the campaign, and it was really the activism of women volunteers in Georgia that drove the campaign forward.
and this is your first run for office, so immediately you jump in to run for Congress. Do people say, hey, Jon, you should take a step back and maybe run for another office, or wait a few years, wait your turn? I mean, what was the initial reaction from even family and friends?
Well, the initial reaction was, who is this guy? And you know, I think when young people step into the arena, they're often met with a degree of skepticism, because politics, I mean, Congress, I forget what the average age of a member of Congress is, but there aren't a lot of young folks serving at high levels, and our generation is not very well represented. But actually, I think what happened is folks got excited about the prospect of some younger voices making their presence felt. And I think that there's a sense among Democrats and Republicans and independents that we need some young blood in Washington, that the generation of politicians in DC who have been ruling for decades, most of them in safe seats, unchallenged, aren't getting the job done, aren't delivering any kind of meaningful results for the people. And that's why one of the messages I wanted to bring here this evening is to encourage more young folks to take that leap, whether it's running for Congress or running for state legislature or municipal office, because we need more young voices in the conversation.
You must have turned on the news today if you thought things were dysfunctional in Washington. You were a Hill staffer, so you were not completely outside of politics. What did you learn as a Hill staffer that you really transferred to you as a candidate, and what did you really learn in the beginning as a candidate that you didn't know before jumping in?
Well, I saw up close working in DC how partisan and bitter and corrupt the system is. But I also saw working for a member of the Armed Services Committee, which is one of the few places in Congress where there's still a degree of bipartisanship, that at the staff level, there's a lot of will to get things done. And a lot of those staffers are young folks who roll their eyes when their bosses perform before the camera and try to score cheap partisan points. But fundamentally, what I saw up close was a pretty broken legislative system. The cozy relationships between lobbyists and the most powerful trade groups and key legislative committees. The way politicians, once they arrive in Washington, become completely consumed by this partisan trench warfare and lose touch so quickly with their constituents. And that experience is why I left Washington in the first place, but also part of the reason that I wanted to return and shake things up a bit.
With so much money in the race, you as a candidate, were you drowned out a lot of the time? So obviously you want to communicate your message to voters, but when you turned on the TV, I'm sure you saw all these different ads that you, both pro and con, that you didn't even know where they were coming from. How hard was it to communicate what you wanted to communicate to voters?
Well, the story of the race in many ways was, as I mentioned, more than 400,000 contributors to my campaign who were giving in small amounts, up against 4 or 5 GOP super PACs who were funded in unlimited amounts, often anonymously. And one of the interesting things was that because my campaign raised significant small dollar contributions from all over the country, one of the attack lines became that there was a lot of outside money pouring into Georgia, and that somehow meant I would be beholden to mysterious out-of-state interests. The irony is that the folks who were driving that message were sitting in super PAC offices in DC collecting, $5 million checks from anonymous donors in Connecticut and all over the country.
A lot of hypocrisy in politics, we certainly know that. Not looking back, but looking to the future, you mentioned young people. You know, what we hear now, and we hear in New Hampshire, is when they're mentioning candidates for president on the Democratic side, we hear old names, people who have run many, many times. What do you think about that, and what do you think about some of these up-and-comers who are thinking about running now, and what their message should be in the future?
Well, one of the rewarding things in what were admittedly a few dark weeks for me after the June 20th runoff was the number of candidates who reached out. Folks who were running for the House, folks who were running for local office, and particularly young candidates who in part had been motivated by what they saw happening in Georgia. And when I look right now at who's leading the effort to push back on the kind of divisive, partisan, the tremendously unhealthy political style that we see in Washington right now, it's women and young people. And I hope that we'll see more folks of my generation, as I said, stepping up to run, but also stepping up to run each other's campaigns, moving into journalism, moving into the public sphere so that we do have those fresh perspectives.
One of the things that Hillary Clinton was criticized about in running for president was she was completely anti-Trump, but not necessarily laying out a vision for the future that the Democratic Party could grasp onto and that voters could embrace. And we see that now a lot, where the energy seems to be anti-Trump, but there isn't necessarily a wave to say, this is the alternative that we want to run on. What do you think those alternatives should be?
Well, when you look at the agenda that's moving through Washington right now, such as anything actually is moving through Washington right now, if you look at the agenda that they're at least trying to move through Congress, I think it's one that pretty transparently serves the most powerful trade groups in the country and the donor class that funds the congressional majority. Our system of government has become so captured by unchecked anonymous money that policymaking is not informed by any consideration of the public interest. And I think that that's what I am most passionate about, more than my disgust with the way I think self-evidently the president disgraces his office. The fact that corruption has reached such a level that we see right now, for example, when we look at the major economic dynamics in this country, high levels of inequality, concentration of power and wealth by the largest commercial organizations at the expense of entrepreneurs and small businesses, sort of lack of dynamism and crumbling infrastructure. And yet, the policy objectives that Congress is pushing are tax breaks for high net worth individuals and those large commercial organizations that don't need it. I think that a message focused on accountability, focused on rooting out that corruption and returning the legislative process to something that considers the needs of ordinary people is a powerful one.
How hard is it, though, to stand up to your own party on some of this? I mean, were you not embraced by some of the leadership because of your message, or did they embrace that message, even if it's a threat to their power as well?
Well, one of the things about small dollar fundraising these days, and I think we're seeing it in Alabama right now as well, but in my race, is that if you can power your campaign with small contributions from ordinary people, as we saw Senator Sanders do during the Democratic primary, then you're accountable to ordinary folks, not to lobbyists and PACs who traditionally have funded political campaigns. Now with the ability using technology to reach so many people and to I think the average single contribution, the average amount of a single contribution to my campaign was about $21. That takes all of those perverse incentives that have made candidates and elected officials beholden to entrenched moneyed interests and turns them on their head. So I hope that's a way toward greater independence for candidates and elected officials and greater accountability for candidates and elected officials to fund campaigns raising money from ordinary people rather than special interests in DC.
So that money would kind of flow on its own, but were you doing a lot of fundraising? Were you just doing message work? I mean, you had so much national attention on this race that it seems that maybe just everybody sort of latched on and sent you a check. Is that sort of the mode, or is there some more, would you have to be making fundraising calls during the day, or how often did you do that?
It did, there was a sort of organic nature to it, and it snowballed as people got excited about the race. I mean, I think your typical congressional candidate winds up spending 30 or 40 hours a week on the phone making fundraising calls. I didn't have to do that because folks were chipping in small amounts, which gave me the freedom to go out and talk to people and hear what their concerns were. I mean, it takes work. You've got to, a digital fundraising campaign doesn't just happen on its own. But I think it's exciting that candidates moving forward may be able to spend more time interacting with voters and getting to know the people that they hope to represent, and less time in a room making phone calls to big donors. And
social media has helped that, I think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that that technology has changed the game, but so too has the Citizens United decision on the other side. I mean, I think what my campaign demonstrated is that ordinary people making small contributions can go toe-to-toe with the anonymously funded super PACs. But not until a decade ago were those super PACs able to raise money, as they do now, in unlimited amounts from anonymous donors. So although I think small dollar fundraising has to be the future and will give the candidates who embrace it a lot of independence, I am extremely concerned by the influence of big anonymous money on politics and its clear influence on our legislative process, as we're seeing right now with the tax legislation and the agenda that's being pushed through Congress right now.
Switching gears a little bit, Olivia mentioned that you're the CEO of a company. Tell us a little bit about that, and is that your future, or are you thinking possibly that you'll stay in elective politics?
Well, I run a company called Insight TWI. It was founded in 1991 by an ex-BBC journalist and specializes in producing documentary and film content for broadcasters like the BBC, international broadcasters all over the world, focused mostly on armed conflict and undercover anti-corruption reports. We just had a crew come out about 3 weeks ago from northern Iraq, where they were documenting the judicial process for ISIS POWs who were engaged in the trade of sex slaves of Yazidi women in northern Iraq. We've got a crew right now in a southern African country investigating a human trafficking story. We have secretly filmed dozens of corrupt judges and officials around the world taking bribes. And that's been the most rewarding work of my life so far, holding powerful people accountable when they abuse their power. And that's the same thing that motivated me to get back into politics, a sense that the abuse of power, that the lack of accountability of our elected officials, the level of corruption in our politics is out of control. And it's been something of a welcome break to be back at the business, focused on journalism. And I haven't made any decisions yet about returning to politics, but the same spirit and the same passion for accountability motivates me in both directions.
Well, before we get to questions, Do your political interests at all sort of motivate how you are picking some of these documentaries and what you're doing on that? And do you see that you'd ever do anything in the political realm with documentaries and things like that?
Well, I mean, the level of corruption, the extent of human suffering around the world are appalling. And doing work as a journalist that helps shine a light on some of that is really satisfying. I hope that our generation can bring some leadership into the political arena that is informed by concern about that kind of thing. I mean, looking around the world right now at the level of violence, in our own society, at what a poor job politicians and policymakers here at home and around the world are doing of trying to move humanity in the right direction. I hope that other young folks like me feel called to step into the fight. I think that our generation might be the last with a chance to change course. We've got environmental crises that are threatening millions of lives and human prosperity, nuclear proliferation, a global economic system that's not functioning well, and very few prominent voices here at home or around the world who are saying, let's stop bickering with each other. Let's stop only looking out for ourselves or our parties and just focus on solving these problems. The solutions are not that mysterious. And that's why our generation has the same kind of responsibility, I think, that my grandparents' generation did. At a time when fascism was on the march, when the Great Depression had impoverished so many people, they stood up and did something about it, and we revere them for it now. I hope we don't let it get that far. I hope it doesn't take a cataclysm for us to assume that responsibility and push things in the right direction.
Why is it getting worse and worse? Why is it getting so partisan? Why is there so much bickering compared to, say, when I got into politics 25 years ago? Why is it getting worse? Is it social media? Is it a different generational take on things? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think that the influence of money, as I mentioned, is a huge problem. The influence of media, who have abandoned any commitment to public interest journalism and instead publish and broadcast blatant propaganda that's meant to deceive and frighten people. It's clear that the folks who are running the country are concerned principally with their own well-being and scoring victories for their political party. And we gotta have a change of approach. I think that we grew up being told that the world was ever going to become a more peaceful and prosperous place, and accepted that as the inevitable arc of history. But recent events, I hope, have shaken us out of that illusion. And again, I hope it doesn't take much worse for our leaders to get their heads screwed on straight again.
Well, I think we want to take some questions from the audience, and we have a microphone set up, so if you have a question, if you could go through the microphone. Don't be shy. Usually everyone starts off kind of shy, and then there's a huge line, so we have a question right here. You have a question?
Yes, sir. the long way around.
Thank you, sir. Do you believe that money plays more of an impact on an election or the message of a candidate?
Did everyone hear the question? The question was, does money play more of a role in elections, or does message play more of a role in elections? I mean, it's tough to say. Without resources, candidates can't get their message out there. But the way candidates raise money changes their message. And that's why, if we can move into a period in American political history, I hope, in the near future, where it's contributions by ordinary people that support candidates, then we'll see more candidates who are speaking to the needs of ordinary people. But as long as trade groups, super PACs, the billionaires who fund so much of the national political apparatus are pulling the strings, we're going to see elected officials and politicians who are speaking to their concerns, who are pushing legislation like we're seeing in Congress right now, which serves the interests of those few with resources rather than ordinary folks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question?
Hi, John.
Hey.
How do you justify running a congressional campaign to represent a district that you didn't actually live in?
Great question, and one that I got many times during the campaign. I grew up in the 6th Congressional District and lived about 1.5 miles outside of its boundaries while my fiance attended medical school at Emory University. She had early morning shifts at the hospital and needed to be able to walk to work. So we lived by Emory so she could walk to work. And I'm proud of the fact that I supported her career, even though I took some political heat for it. And I think the question is, do candidates understand the concerns and needs of the folks that they are trying to represent? And I'm Georgia born and raised, grew up in the 6th District. Alicia's now doing some postgraduate work overseas, so I'm back in the 6th District. Hopefully that resolves your concern. And I think once folks heard the full story, it was not much of an issue. Thank you.
So, hello, I'm Saiku. So what I thought was interesting was that you were opportunistic and you attacked a constituency that leaned right, of course. But what kind of policies would you have tried to push forward to not just encourage your base to vote for you again next election cycle, but to usher in a sense of bipartisanship that would have made it okay for your entire constituency to want to feel comfortable to vote for you again?
That's a great question. And I believe in building coalitions. I believe that the role of a representative is not to impose their own views rigidly on those they seek to represent, but to understand the concerns and interests of everyone they seek to represent, and to present a platform that's sensitive to those concerns. And that's the kind of campaign that I ran. And I reached out to every voter in the district humbly and respectfully. And rather than spending my time on partisan invective, put together a platform that I thought would serve the economic development of that district and that represented a broad range of views in that district that were consistent with the core values of the community. And I think that one of the, and this gets to Neil, one of your questions earlier, partisan politicians and our national political media would have us believe that we're much more divided than we really are. And certainly in Georgia, and I think across the country, our interests and our values are much more aligned than perhaps we realize at times. We all want greater prosperity and opportunity in our communities. We all want more affordable higher education. We all want access to health care when we need it. The overwhelming majority of folks favor civil rights and civil liberties and want a healthy, clean planet. So I tried to run a campaign that was focused on those shared values and shared interests, even though that's not that fashionable in politics these days.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we have a line.
Okay.
Hi, Mr. Ossoff.
Hey.
So earlier you mentioned the Republican Congress trying to push through bills, maybe not so successfully so far. This past summer was one of the Obamacare repeal attempts. If you were in Congress, what would you be supporting? Or I guess I'm asking, what is your stance on health care, and which way would you go with that?
Well, I think that the first principle for me on health care is that it should be universal. And we are the only advanced industrialized country in the world that still has a huge share of our population that lacks access to health care and health insurance when they need it. To my point earlier about the solutions to these problems not always being so mysterious, there's not just one way to get there. And I'd like to see public servants in Washington serve the public by sitting down and finding some common sense ways to improve the laws on the books so that we can get there. And they could if they wanted to. They don't want to because their objective is to score partisan points. House Republicans have been promising that they would repeal the Affordable Care Act for a decade. And that alone has been the objective. Not to improve upon it, not to tackle skyrocketing premiums and expand access, but simply to repeal it because that's a way to score partisan points. So, look, there are many different countries around the world that have universal health care, and they get there by many different means. And we can find a way to get there here in this country. We just need some political will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, so this is more sort of a logistical question.
Okay.
But how did you and your campaign plan on advertising that you were able to get so many people to vote for you and donate towards your campaign through the whole thing as sort of a newcomer?
Well, the most potent part of the campaign was our field program, our grassroots door knocking program, and it was volunteer driven. Thousands and thousands of people, many of whom had never been involved before, who were given a lot of time, not because of me, but because of their concern about the times that we're living in. And there's nothing more effective at getting out the vote than neighbors talking to neighbors at the doorstep. And I think that the program was highly effective. I mean, take this with a grain of salt because I lost the campaign. But usually special elections are low turnout affairs. And Democratic turnout in the 6th District last June was at presidential year levels, which speaks to the power of that kind of grassroots field operation and the amount of volunteer intensity that's out there. And that was also the most fun part of the campaign, was working with those volunteers.
Thank you.
You think you're going to have that same kind of turnout in 2018 nationwide for the Democrats?
Well, I think clearly that volunteer intensity is out there. And again, prefacing this with that grain of salt, given that I was unsuccessful, the advice that I've humbly given candidates who have reached out to me is the campaigns that present the kind of volunteer experience that keeps people coming back and gives them a sense of investment in the campaign, and that's positive and uplifting rather than angry, I think are the ones who will have success getting out voters.
Question.
Hi. So you mentioned young people getting out and getting into Congress, and a lot of times we see voters vote for people that they see themselves in, and they're like, they can be common with. So how difficult do you think it is for these young people to get out and win congressional races when, frankly, voter turnout among young people isn't the best? And furthermore, how do we get those young people to come out and vote so they can win with like these low numbers as they are right now?
Great question.
Great question. I think that we're seeing something of a renaissance of civic engagement in the country right now. And I think that includes our generation. Sometimes a crisis has a way of clarifying things and clarifying the stakes and clarifying the cost of apathy and inaction. So it's a question of whether we are going to stand up and do it. No one can do it for us. But I'm confident that we will if we stay focused and stay united and remind ourselves every day of the human consequences of these elections. I mean, in Virginia, there was very high turnout among young voters historically. We saw that in Georgia as well. Do you have a follow-up?
No, I didn't know if you were done, but if you're done, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Do you have a prediction with Judge Moore?
I do not. Judge Moore.
Good avoidance on that one.
Hi, my name's Claire, and I'm a senior politics major. Over the summer, I was lucky enough to intern in a Democratic congressional office where I really agreed with my boss's messaging and mission. But as a former Hill staffer, my question for you is, what is your advice to young people like myself who might be disheartened by what they see behind the scenes, or maybe they disagree with their boss's partisan tactics, and they don't know how to approach that?
Well, I'd encourage young staffers to speak their minds and tell their bosses, with all due respect, how they feel. And I think a lot of the folks who have been in DC for a long time find it very mysterious what the young folks think these days, and actually will be quite eager to hear what their young staffers think is on the minds of their peers. So I think we need to be outspoken in all dimensions of our lives, professionally, personally, politically, take risks to make our voices heard, whether that means speaking up in the workplace or running for office.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hi. So I think it's really admirable that so much of your fundraising came from like such small contributions from regular people. And I think that there are a lot of candidates out there who probably ideally would like to run a campaign that way, but feel like they won't get elected if they don't turn toward super PACs or special interests, even if they don't want to be like beholden to those people. Do you think it's possible for more and more candidates to run campaigns like yours and fundraise from ordinary people without like massive policy changes or like under Citizens United?
I think it is possible for candidates to swear off PAC money and focus on fundraising from individuals and focus on small dollar fundraising. But as long as the Supreme Court keeps the door cracked for that unlimited anonymous money, I'm not sure, but it will solve our problems. I think it'll let us fight back. But when I think about Citizens United, regardless of your political party, I mean, who thinks it's a good idea that unlimited anonymous money flows into the political system? I've never had anyone make the case to me
Yeah.
that's great public policy and that serves our democracy. Unfortunately, there's not a quick legislative fix because the court's ruling is based on a constitutional interpretation. But there are things that Congress could do to chip away at the influence of anonymous money in politics. And I think until we do that, our democracy is going to remain broken.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Christina. I'm a sophomore politics major, and I was wondering if you felt like you had to work twice as hard to prove your legitimacy being so young and running for a seat in office, and if so, how did you overcome that? Because I feel as someone young running for office, it could be hard to prove that you've done enough and you're prepared enough to hold this seat, as opposed to someone who's maybe twice your age, who has a bit more work experience than you do.
I wouldn't worry about it. I think overall folks are hungry for younger voices and fresh voices. And regardless of your generation, it excites people that there are young people stepping up and taking risks to try to make a difference. There are always going to be haters. Your adversaries will always find something to latch onto. That's just the way of the world. But the response that I overwhelmingly got from folks across the political spectrum, even folks who disagreed with me strongly on some of the issues, was an appreciation that young people were stepping up to the plate. So I don't think that should deter any young person from taking the plunge.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm glad I'm going after Christina because my question really kind of segues into that a lot, because it's a problem I see with a lot of young people, and particularly young women, who I think it's really important for them to really take the step and get involved, is a lot of times you feel as though you're underqualified, and that's not just in the political realm, but a lot of times, like I said, especially young women feel that they're not as qualified for these positions or these roles or these offices as others. So what's the best way that we can kind of encourage, as young people, to encourage other young people to take the plunge and take that step and say, you don't have to have a decade's worth of political experience to be a congressperson? What is the best way to start those dialogues? Because it's not necessarily the most popular way to go.
Well, I would lean into youth and a fresh perspective that's untainted by decades climbing the slippery pole as an asset. I mean, a lot of folks who serve us in Washington have spent way too long in politics, and they're not better off for it. They do a worse job because of it. So lean into it. I think, like I said, I encourage folks to embrace the fresh perspective that they can bring. And are you going to get attacked for it? Yes. You're going to get attacked for everything. But remember, if they're attacking you, you're doing something right.
Thank you.
How you doing? I'd be interested in your opinion of the electoral process as it stands today, with specifically gerrymandering, closed primaries, and voter ID laws. And I know money in politics is important, but what about groups and organizations actually trying to suppress the vote? And what would you do if you had a choice to change anything?
Yeah, and voter suppression is a story as old as the South. And it goes on. I mean, I was getting some reports on election day of robocalls, automated phone calls that were going into black neighborhoods, informing them that the election was the following week. we worked as hard as we could to make sure folks were informed about their rights. But it requires congressional oversight of the Department of Justice to enforce voting rights legislation and civil rights legislation. Right now we have an Attorney General whose contempt for voting rights and civil rights legislation is no secret. And I think it's a disgrace that any elected official in any party would try to restrict the franchise and try to deny people their constitutional rights to vote. Gerrymandering is, I think, an example of partisanship gone haywire, of folks looking at governance as just a means of serving partisan political ends. Folks arriving in power and deciding that the best thing they can do with their authority is enhance the power of their party rather than serve the people who elected them. And gerrymandering also has the perverse effect of pushing us all into our extreme partisan corners. Because when the majority of districts where the primary is the only race that matters, there's no incentive for candidates to try to build those kinds of coalitions, to try to find common ground. It's all about appealing to the base. And that's why we wind up with a Congress that where no one can talk to each other.
And your opinion on closed primaries?
Closed primaries. Look, I think anything that makes it harder for folks to exercise their right to vote is not in the public interest. It's not something that I've given a tremendous amount of thought to. It doesn't immediately strike me as much of a problem as voter suppression and gerrymandering, but I'd certainly be willing to have the conversation maybe after this session with you about some of the impacts on democracy of the closed primary system and what needs to be done to fix it.
Thank you.
Well, I'll take the last question.
Yeah.
So you have a great message, and I think it's a great message for Democrats. Are you going to start going across the country campaigning for candidates going into 2018, and what are you going to do to help the party, your party, as we go into the next cycle?
Well, if folks think I'd be helpful, you know, I'm willing to help. I think that party alone is not sufficient for any of us to support a candidate. But where there are great candidates and great Democratic candidates who think I could be helpful, then I'm happy to be there.
Well, thank you very much for coming tonight. It's been great. I know that you haven't decided if you're going to put your name on the ballot again, but I have to tell you that we hope that you'll come back here again, and I would guess that we'll probably see a lot of him in the future. So thank you, Jon.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.